Shalom Aleichem, good evening, welcome one, welcome all, those who are joining us live, those who will be watching later on, those who are joining us on Facebook, on Chabad.org, those who are joining us on the YouTube page, welcome one, welcome all. Mazel tov, mazel tov. We're celebrating the Siyum, the completion, the culmination of the 11th book of the Rambam book. As we do so, we ask God Almighty, we ask the Eibishter to please put an end to all Nezikin, to please put an end to all destruction within this world. And as we do so, we have no doubt that our limud Torah, one of the ways to bring peace, Torah, is the vehicle and the means that peace is brought to the world. So the Eibishter should help that our limud Torah, that us learning together and celebrating the completion of book number 11 and entering and venturing on into book number 12, the book of 10, Kinyan, should bring Hatzlacha, should bring success to the efforts for peace around the world, both Begashmis and Beruchnis, for all of our brethren, especially for those who are in flight and traveling right now to safety and security. So let us open today, and we have a very special guest on together with us. We have for Nezikin, Rabbi Shlomo Yaffe. He lives in Springfield, Massachusetts. He's the Rav at Congregation Bnei Torah. He's also the Dean of the Institute of American and Talmudic Law, which is based in New York. And he's the rabbinical director of the Massachusetts Kashrus Commission. Rabbi Yaffe is known for his ability to weave and to synthesize halacha and modern Jewish life. And as we complete and we conclude Sefer Nezikin, it's an honor to have Rabbi Yaffe here to take us from the world of the Rambam in text to the contemporary Rambam. So Rabbi Yaffe, if we can ask you to unmute yourself, please, and to join us here for the scene. Good evening, Rabbi Yaffe.
Good evening to you.
Good
nice
evening.
To be here.
So everyone is thinking about the news is Ukraine, the news is Russia, and I guess we'll leave it to you to put the Rambam in context and see if perhaps Sefer Nezikin in any way, shape, or form can shed some light and can be of interest to us as we try to understand the situation through a halakhic lens as well as through prayer. So with that, I know it's an open-ended question. There's some noise and some movement in the background. Okay.
It's not for me.
Okay. And could you perhaps take us on the book of Nezikin and Ukraine and Russia? How's that?
Okay. Well, it so happens that the Rambam in Mishnah Torah in Hilchos Gezela Vaveda, which is one of the sections of Hilchos Nezikin, discusses the question of taxation, and we establish that Dino de Malchusa Dino, the law of the government of the king, because that was the traditional form of government back then, is the law, and a Jew has to follow it, and you're not allowed to avoid paying the taxes unless the system of taxation is corrupt. In other words, the king, like the tax farmers of the Bourbon regime in France, that they would buy the right to the tax and then squeeze out of people as much as they can. It's not a set amount set by the government. So in such a case, one is allowed to lie and so on to avoid paying taxes. And furthermore, if it's not a legitimate king, a legitimate government, so Perek Hey Halacha Yivches, when it is said the Melech Shematbeo Yotzei Beisan Haratzos, the king whose his coinage, his currency is accepted in those countries. So that's brought in other places. Though you should know that the Gemaras, that the sources in the Talmud, that the commentaries on the Rambam quote only talk about someone who gets up on his own and decides to tax, sort of, like mafia protection racket or something. It doesn't talk about the legitimacy of a king or not. But the Rambam adds that if his coinage is accepted...
I understood that, Rabbi Yaffe. So again, a legitimate government, you have to pay the taxes to. Now, what about a mafia who comes in and they say, everyone on the block, if you don't want to get your windows bashed in, you have to pay a tax to us?
So that you don't have to pay, and you're allowed to lie and so on. It's not a legitimate government. And by the same token, now, if it would just be his coinage is accepted, The Nazis marched into occupied Europe and made their own money, and everyone had to use it. The same thing when the Soviet Union became the Soviet Union. They took away everyone's gold and silver money and gave worthless paper. Now,
So you would have to pay the taxes in the Soviet Union?
Oh, so the Rambam says, so here's the thing. So the Rambam adds the word Shariskimola Bnei Yisrael. The members, the people of that country have accepted him, and they've accepted that he is their master, and they are his servants, which is the traditional method. So in other words, the acceptance of the coinage, in a sense, has to be willingly, because otherwise the Rambam wouldn't have to use the words they agreed. So as long as the only reason that one accepts a government is because of force, is because you're being forced by threat of arms. So the Rambam says that it's not a king, but it's Kamo. The government is like a bunch of armed robbers, that their law is not a law. And this king and all his servants are like thieves, are like robbers in all matters. So the fact that, to me, it seems the fact that the Rambam adds to the Gemara this whole story and says that the Samcha Daita, they've accepted that he's their master, that there has to be a degree of acceptance of the government. As long as the people, why do we mention armed robbers? Why not just robbers? Because in the laws of Geneva, the commentaries on the Gemara mention that the idea of all the commentaries, both on the Rambam and the Gemara itself, mention the idea of an armed robber is that he can frighten you, that you're afraid of his weapons. So the fact that Maimonides uses this language, the Rambam uses this language, is telling us a very interesting thing. That if the only reason you feel that you have to obey a ruler is because you're afraid of their power to kill you, that is not a legitimate government. They're armed robbers, and so in the Soviet Union, it's hard to know. I mean, with the Soviet Union after the Russian Civil War, and especially if you're Jewish, given the depredations of the whites and the like, it could be the people were willing to accept the Soviet government because it brought some degree of peace and harmony and so on. Unless you lived in the Ukraine when he starved 17 million Ukrainians to death under Stalin. But if you weren't the Ukrainians starved to death, maybe it wasn't so terrible.
So you're a rabbi, I'm coming to you in the Soviet Union. I say, do I have to pay my taxes to Brezhnev? The answer is yes.
The answer is probably yes, because most people begrudgingly accepted the government and certainly preferred it to the white Russians or the Nazis and so on. That being said, if you look at if you look at the case of the American Revolution or even the Baltics from 1940 to the 90s, one can argue that the only reason that they accepted the Soviet government was because of the threat of force of arms. So they may not have been likely to. This also, I pointed out once that this also relates to the question of legitimacy of rebellion and revolution. So in the case of Russia and the Ukraine, even if Russia succeeds in conquering the Ukraine, as long as the people are only listening to their Russian overlords because of the threat of arms, they're like armed robbers. And the rule with an armed robber is that if you feel that person's threatening you, you can arise and kill him first. So all forms of violence and revolution and guerrilla warfare are all absolutely permitted according to the way the Rambam understands this.
So if I in America today decide I don't want to accept the American government by myself?
No, so it goes Medina, goes by the country. So it goes by the majority of the country as a whole, whatever is defined as a country. So if Alabama decides again it doesn't want to be part of the U.S., tough luck, Charlie. That's the language Medina. And in general, if you look at the Rishonim, they all talk about a Medina. Their Medinas were typically smaller, but lav dafka. Now, I should also make the point, because we discussed this earlier today, that the question of legitimacy, whether it extends, if one country goes and conquers another, is that legitimate? So we discussed, I had mentioned that a conquest by one non-Jewish nation of another is actually prohibited. It's a form of murder under the laws of Noach.
So, but before we get to the Rabbi, I just want everyone to be clear and so just understand, because you made a very, very interesting point. So what you're saying is that, just to bring it to Ukraine and Russia, that if a government overtakes another government, of people, and that people does not accept them. They do not have to have allegiance to them. They don't have to pay taxes, and they can lie and cheat to get out of paying taxes.
And they can treat them like armed robbers, which means you can kill them whenever you get the chance to kill them, if you can get away with it.
So just again, before we move to the next topic, so in the context of what we're looking at now, so long as the Ukrainians don't,
the majority of people in the Ukraine don't accept the Russian conquest. So the Russians are no better than armed robbers with all the law that applies to armed robbers.
And at a certain point in time, if they put in, let's say, a puppet government that becomes loyal to, if the majority happens sort of organically, once they agree, now they have to be loyal to their laws and pay their taxes.
Right, but again, as the Rambam points out earlier in Hilchos Gezeilah Vaveda, which is really not the case even today in Russia, that only applies if everyone is taxed equally, if there's a code and a system. But if it's a corrupt system where the taxman
if you're a Jew and you have to pay more, then or if you're
right. So, for example, how there's all the jokes about Jews skipping the taxes in Tsarist Russia, and so on, and smuggling things. The fact is that because Jews were taxed differently, and not just differently as a unit, but arbitrarily, even within individuals, they had no obligation to pay those taxes. That's the whole point. And regrettably, that caused that when people came here, because they lived under corrupt regimes in Eastern and Central Europe and so on, they got into the habit of skipping taxes. In this country, it's quite clear that since there's a system and it's just and it doesn't favor.
Well, that might be debatable, but that's for a different topic.
Those distinctions are universal. You might not like a progressive system and so on. But the fact is, there's one system for everyone. Individuals are not singled out for extortion.
Uh-huh.
And since that's the case, the obligation to pay your taxes is an obligation from the Torah, the same as the obligation to put on tefillin and so on. So, an important point. But that's
the end of that issue. So now you're discussing another issue, which is a very, very interesting topic, and I think this is really interesting for everyone to understand and to talk about. Rabbi Yaffe is going to give us a little insight into what the legitimacy of one country attacking another country to begin with. If that's a bad thing, a good thing, allowed, not allowed, that's murder or not. So go ahead, give us some insight on that.
So there is a sefer from someone from the Devar Avram. The Devar Avram was the Rav of Kovna. His name was Shapira. He died during the Holocaust of disease in 1943. Tremendous chacham. And he wrote a sefer of Shilas Teshuvos, but they're more in the style of sugyas, of discussions of Talmudic themes. And in Chelik Aleph, Siman Yud Aleph, he discusses this very question, the legitimacy of conquest, because it says that the Jews were allowed to take the sections of the Moabite land that Sichon conquered, because Torah was purified by Sichon. In other words, since Sichon conquered it, it ceased to be Moab's. Moab gave up. So even though we're not allowed to take Moab's land until the final Mashiach, we can take Moab's land now because it was. So he points out that this is because of Yush. We learned a little bit later in the laws of losing things that if someone gives up hope of ever getting something back, they lose ownership of it. So he says that only Rabbeinu Tam, there's a range of Rishonim, Rashi, the Rameh, others all hold that the only one allowed to engage in an optional war to take more land is a Jewish king. And I looked it up. The Rambam says that he's supposed to contact the Sanhedrin first. But at any rate,
so just to clarify for everybody, so if America would like to invade Canada tomorrow because it strategically needs it, because of the oil, by Jewish law, we think that is forbidden, that is prohibited.
Except for Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam says that that there is a concept of conquest of one country to another. According to all the other majority of Rishonim, as Devar Avram puts it, that only applies to a Jewish king who needs to expand the land of Israel. And again, he's supposed to consult the Sanhedrin. In such a case, it's permissible. But non-Jews are not allowed to conquer each other. If they do, and the people give up hope of ever getting it back, like the Mattapan Indians aren't getting back all of Boston. So once they give up hope, then it ceases to be their land. with the exception of the Jewish people, with Eretz Yisrael, with the land of Israel, because God gave them to them permanently, and that's a halachic concept. But according to everyone, basically, but Rabbeinu Tam and those who follow him, a non-Jewish country, a non-Jewish king isn't allowed. In other words, there's no such thing as conquest. Being that there's no such legal thing, we presume that it's illegal. And if you kill people, you're liable for murder under the Noahide laws. In other words, there's no excuse for murder because I wanted to conquer another country. This is the majority opinion of the Rishonim, at least as the Devar of Ram, who's the only one I saw who ever really worked this out, discusses it. It's a safer.
It's fascinating because for the majority of the history of the world, if you had a more strategic position or you had resources and I wanted to take them, we took them. That's the way the world works.
Well, the fact that's the way the world works, and we talk about kibush, we talk about those things all the time. The fact that's the way the world works doesn't make it right. In other words, most of the world served idols. Most of the world, engaged in, all of Egypt engaged in incest in their royal marriages, forbidden by the Noahide laws. People murdered their crippled children, forbidden by the Noahide laws. The fact that people behave in a way that the Sheva Mitzvot Bnei Noach do not allow is not a surprise. That's one of the reasons why that's one of the Mashiach's jobs, is to get the whole world to follow the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach. But my point is that a war, there are many differences in the laws of war, but that only applies if you're allowed to be fighting a war. And I don't even know if Rabbeinu Tam holds it's permitted. It's just he says there's a concept of conquest also by non-Jews. But the other Rishon and the other medieval authorities all hold there's no legal concept of conquest, only Yiyush.
Once a war would be started, then the regular war, wouldn't the regular laws of war take be in play?
Yes, there would be. That's true, but I'm saying the regular laws of war allow a degree of preemptive strike that wouldn't be permitted. They allow a degree for individuals defending themselves. They allow a degree of collateral damage. But maybe we should talk about that in Sefer Shoftim. But what I'm saying is that there are a lot of laws of war. It's something that I've done some research on. There are a lot of laws of war. But anyways.
Wow, Rabbi Yaffe, you never fail to be able to bridge and to take us from the world of Torah to the world that we're living in right now. And I guess just an interesting question just that comes to mind for me. Do you think this is what we as Yidden should be doing? Should we be looking for legitimacy and looking through the lens of Torah when it comes to events like Russia, Ukraine? Is this something that should there be more articles? Should we be thinking about this?
Well, we should be thinking about it because, again, so the Ramah, I believe it's Tshuva Yud Aleph. The Ramah discusses the idea, it was a copyright case about printing the Rambam, actually. Very famous. It's the source of all of modern halachic copyright and patent law. So in that Tshuva, to me, the most fascinating part of the Tshuva is where he says that anything that is a matter for Bnei Noach, right? Like the justice of cheating someone's copyright. Because, in general, the Noahide laws include all kinds of cheating and so on. So what's really interesting to me is that he suggests that any halacha that's worked out by Bnei Yisrael in the Talmud and Perokim that relates to Bnei Noach are obliged to follow what Bnei Yisrael worked out in the Gemara and Perokim. In that inyan, say about Geneva, say about taxes, whatever it is. Why is that important? Because it follows then that if we have influence, and nowadays Jews have influence, that if we have influence, we should be advocating for those approaches that the Torah law applies, provided it's an approach that relates to the Jewish people whole. This famous Italian rabbi Benevista wrote this book where he demonstrates like 200 mitzvahs that are related to the Sheva mitzvahs. So where something is related to Sheva mitzvahs Bnei Noach, the correct thing for the world to do is whatever the Jews worked out in the Shas and Perokim. And therefore, that is the legitimate moral and ethical thing to do, and we should be sharing it with the world. That being said, that's separate from the question of what to say when and to whom and on what platform, because obviously it's one thing if someone asks for your opinion. It's another thing for standing up and saying that something is very wrong because we know it's very wrong, but saying so where you have no ability to influence the situation, but you have the ability to antagonize someone who's extremely unstable, who could make the lives miserable for about 1 million Jews. So
you're suggesting that if Putin asks for our opinion, we should give it, but perhaps we ought not preemptively go and tell him what to do.
Precisely because he doesn't seem to be an individual who takes kindly to advice. But generally, in other words, occasionally you come across a very dangerous and destructive person who doesn't pick on the Jews. So, it's important to leave it that way. What should I tell you?
At least we'll paskin according to Torah, and the Eibishter who will follow the psak din of Torah.
Right, but I'm still saying to speak in general is one thing. In other words, to tell people that the Torah of Am Yisrael, who are the representatives, literally Hashem's representing this world, agree that what they're doing is the right thing. That's another story. But I'm simply saying that people who say to me, oh well, since this is the right thing, and since this is tzedek creation, this is justice and righteousness, therefore certain in Rabbi X should say something to politician Y. That's not necessarily the case, because as the old Yiddish saw goes, one must always tell the truth, but one must not always tell all the truth all the time, the entire truth all the time. So, that's a cautionary tale.
You outdid yourself. Thank you. And I know that we had said that the organizers had arranged that the shliach from Ukraine was going to do the Siyum. Unfortunately, the shliach is not able to join us. He was going to, but unfortunately he's not. Rabbi Yaffe, can we please ask you and honor you with concluding Sefer Nezikin, and in so doing, hopefully concluding the Nezikin around the world. So I put it up on the screen right now, and let us please study together the final halacha.
Okay, so we're talking here about, your enemy's donkey is collapsing under the load and you don't want him to stay on the road, so you help him out. So the question is, who's the enemy? So this enemy is not a Gentile, but rather a Jew. One might ask, how is it possible? Now, for the sake of, as it's explained elsewhere, for the sake of peace and harmony in the world, apropos of what Rabbi Resnick was talking about, one should also help a non-Jew. But the core requirement in the Torah is to help a Jew. So one might ask, how is it possible for one Jew to hate another? Isn't it written, Lo sisna sachicha b'levecha, do not hate your brother in your heart? So our sages explain that's referring to a person who sees a colleague violate a colleague. Now, the point is, Sharo Levado, Sharo Aveir of Israel, it doesn't say colleague here. You saw someone sinning and warned him, though elsewhere it says that one should only be, judged strongly, someone who knows better. You should have to hate him, and it explains in Tanya, it means you should hate the badness in him, not the rest of him, until he does tshuva and returns from his wickedness. Even though he didn't yet do tshuva. You find him all panicking because of his load. It's a mitzvah to unload, liton to load and unload with him, and not leaving him in danger of life, in danger of death. Why? Because if he stays on the road late at night because of his property, over there he'll come to danger. And the Torah is concerned equally so on the souls of the Jewish people, bein Rishayim, bein Tzadikim, whether they are righteous or wicked, because the soul of a Jew is always holy, and the wickedness and righteousness, as the Rambam said earlier in the laws of divorce, is only because his Yetzer Hara is putting him under duress. Since they are connected to Hashem and believe in the fundamentals of Judaism, as it says, as Yechezkel says, I swear, it says Hashem Elokim, if I desire, if I desire that the death of the wicked, ki but rather I desire that the wicked should return from their evil ways and live. So therefore, we want to make sure that the person lives to do tshuva, and therefore we don't leave him in danger to life, even if he's done very serious sins that he knows better and you warned him, and so on. And over here, the Rambam is really addressing a concept that he addressed earlier, again in Ilchos Gerushin, that the fundamental nature of a Jew is the good, is the goodness in their neshama, and therefore we want to make sure that he stays alive and not just because he'll do tshuva, but also because simply Hashem values the soul of a Jew, the life of a Jew, even if they're a Russia at the moment. In other words, irrespective of whether they do tshuva or not. That's an important diuk, an important note in the Rambam, that even though we want them to do tshuva, Hashem is concerned with the lives of his children, whether they are wicked or righteous. And
Mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov.
We finish with this Brich Rachmana de Siyum. The Rambam actually wrote that. Blessed is the merciful one who enabled us to finish this.
And with this, we will go right into Sefer Nezikin, the 12th book of the Rambam. The Rambam teaches us, I'll just read the opening, Halacha v'hamekach in nikla midvarim. Verbal agreements do not create acquisition. Even if you have witnesses that say the two people agreed to sell or give something to each other. For example, if I say, hey, I'm giving you this something I'm going to sell you this wine, this servant, this house, and even if they they establish a price, and the buyer says okay, and they say they bought it, and the seller says okay, I'm sold it. And they get two people and they say, hey, you guys, you watch this, make sure that this happens. You're testifying. This is meaningless. It's as if nothing happened. They can always renege on it because they haven't actually formed a formal acquisition. The same thing would be whether you give or receive a gift. And the Rambam will then proceed to tell us how we actually do establish and substantiate the transfer of property. Rabbi Yaffe, God bless you. Thank you very much. May the Eibusher should give you long life and health and nachas to be able to continue teaching Torah and applying it so clearly to the modern world. Hatzlacha, thank you very, very much for joining us. And now for everybody on. Thank you, Rabbi Yaffe. Thank you. And now we're going to put up the quiz on Sefer Nezikin. The prize, the winner will receive an Eitzer HaMelech commentary on the Rambam. Let's see how well we learned this, the Sefer Nezikin. I'll read the questions for those of you who are watching later and won't be able to see the actual poll on the screen. Number one, which of the following halachas are not found in Sefer Nezikin? Is it number one, Nizkei Mammon? Number two, Tayin V'Nitin? Number three, Chayvel Amazik? And number four, Geneva? Question number two, how many conditions did Yeshua make when he and his Bezdin divided Eretz Yisrael? Did they make 3, 5, 10, or 7? Number three, if a camel loaded with straw walks by a store and catches fire from the lantern and causes a large fire, who's responsible? If number one, if the lantern was inside, the camel owner is responsible. Number two, if the lantern was outside, the store owner is responsible. Number three, the lantern was outside, even if it's a Hanukkah menorah, then the store owner is still responsible, or all of the above. Number four, which of the following cases are considered to be geneva, but no kefil, you do not pay doubly so? Number one, if a person steals from hektish. Number two, if a person stole by using a rigged scale. Number four, if a person admits that he stole. Or number four, if a person was a shomer for an item of a minor, and then he falsely claimed that the item was stolen. Question number five, what is the slippery slope of prohibitions a person can, God forbid, fall into? Do you fall first lois sisave, then lois sachma, then lois sigza? Is it lois sachma, lois sisave, and lois sigza? Is it lois sigza, lois sisave, and lois sachma? Or is it lois sisave, lois sigza, and lois sachma? Number six, if a king chopped down trees of private owners and made a bridge, may one benefit from the bridge? Number one, yes, if the king has been accepted by the subject and his coin is a usable currency. Number two, it is considered armed robbery. Number 3, if one could swim across the river, then the bridge can be used as well. Otherwise, it's forbidden. Or number 4, one who is extra scrupulous should not use a bridge under any circumstances. What? Number 7, if someone chances upon his own lost item, his father's and his teacher's, Rabbi Muvak, his dedicated primary teacher of Torah, what is the order, a correct hierarchy of retrieving the items? Is it your father, then your teacher, then your own item? Your own, your father, your teacher, your father, your own, your teacher, your father, or whichever he prefers, what is the correct order? Number 8, regarding what din, what law does the Rambam bring? A leniency, he teaches us a leniency of responsibility when it's late on Friday afternoon. Number 1, if one sees a lost item late Friday afternoon, they may ignore it. Number 2, if one starts a fire on Erev Shabbos right before Shabbos while cooking, he is exempt. Number 3, if one collides into his friend while running Erev Shabbos, he is exempt. Number 4, if an ox gores Erev Shabbos, the owner is exempt due to the pre-Shabbos stress. Number 9, if a person, God forbid, hires a mercenary to kill someone, is the one who hired considered to be the murderer? Number 1, yes, they are deemed to be the murderer and can receive capital punishment. Number 2, yes, they are deemed to be the murderer but cannot receive capital punishment. Number 3, there is no shliach for an avera, therefore they are not considered to be the murderers. Or number 4, none of the above. And lastly, the last question here is, how does the Rambam explain the words of the pasuk Nachal Esan? Number 1, is it a valley which has hard ground? Number 2, a river which flows strongly? Number 3, a well whose water refreshes and strengthens the Esan of the neshama? Or is it number 4, a young calf which is very strong? We'll keep this up for another 30 seconds and then I will go through the answers. Okay. All right, here we go. And the answers are, and I see the answers are, which laws are not in this book? Laws of Tayin V'Nitin. How many conditions did Yeshua make when he came and divided Israel? 10. What happens if the camel walks by the store and catches on fire? The answer was all of the above, which means if the lantern is inside, then the camel owner is responsible. If the lantern is outside, even if it's Hanukkah, then the store owner is responsible. When are you considered a ganav, but you don't pay kefil, you don't pay double? The answer was all of the above. If you steal from the Beis Hamikdash, if you steal using a rigged scale, if you admit that you stole, or if someone was watching an item and he falsely claimed that the item was stolen, in all those cases, you're going to have to pay kefil. What's the slippery slope order? Well, first leisesave. First you have a feeling, then leisachme, then you actually pressure him to sell it, and then leisigzal. If he doesn't do that, then you actually steal it from him. What if the king chopped down the tree, a private owner's, and he makes a bridge? Can you use it? Well, as Rabbi Yaffe discussed with us, if the king has been accepted and if his coin is usable currency, then yes, you're allowed to. What's the order? If you find property, what's the order? You find 3 pieces of property, your own, your teacher's, and your father's. Well, that's the order. First, your own, then your teacher, and then your father.
Answering the question. Siyum is finished.
That is the number 8. Regarding what law does the Rambam bring? He tells a leniency. He says responsible when on Erev Shabbos. When is there a leniency? That's what you'll remember. If you're running, it's before Shabbos, and you collide with your friend and you injure each other. Well, it's before Shabbos. You are exempt. You're running around before Shabbos. And if a person, God forbid, hires a mercenary, are they considered to be the murderer? Well, they're not the murderer in the sense that they can be tried in court. So the answer was number 2. They're deemed to be the murderer, but they can't receive capital punishment. There is no shliach. It's a little bit tricky because they're not considered to be the murderers. So 2 or 3 might have been correct, but the correct answer is 2. They're deemed to be the murderer, but they cannot receive capital punishment. And what is the Esan? The Esan was the river that flows very strongly. Thank you very much, everyone who's joining us live, those who are going to be watching, those who will be when it's posted online, those who are watching on Chabad.org. Yashakach, thank you very much. And with this Siyum, we take the strength to go into Sefer Kinyan, which we will, God willing, perform the Siyum on. Not that long. There's some 80 chapters or so in the Sefer Kinyan. So in 25 days or so, we look forward to seeing everyone back here. Hatzlacha Rabba, a good evening, a good morning, a good afternoon. And thank you very much. Mazel tov, mazel tov.